Going live in 45 seconds. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation today. We're going to start in about 1 minute. Hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. My name is Isha Weerasinghe. I'm a senior policy analyst at CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy, and I sit on the mental health and youth teams. I am currently I sit on Nacotchtank or Anacostan and Piscataway lands, otherwise known as Washington, D.C. We're having this conversation today as part of the Healing-Centered Liberation Policy work at CLASP. Healing-Centered Liberation Policy, or HCLP, asks us to reimagine how public policy can respond to inequity, which looks beyond our current existing systems that have been created on the frameworks of historical and cultural and structural racism. HCLP, Healing-Centered Liberation Policy, thinks beyond what is, and it demands us to think about what should be. It acknowledges failed and abandoned policies and asks us to think about new decision-making structures and recognizes both historical harms and ongoing discrimination. As a continuation of this ongoing discussion of what is needed for us to truly thrive, and in line with CLAS's work on mental health and well-being, and the recognition of the particular impacts on communities of color, we wanted to have this conversation about healing justice. So I have here with me our friend and Mental Health Advisory Board member, Cara Page. But before going into introducing Cara, I wanted to note a couple of logistics. So although we're not on Zoom today, we're on Facebook Live, we ask you to submit any questions or comments that you have throughout the discussion in that comment box, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout and at the end. I'm going to note that also this isn't the end of the discussion, so any questions that we aren't able to answer, we'll take note of. And if you want to start the conversation or continue the conversation on social, please use the hashtag #InvestToHeal throughout the conversation. And finally, this conversation is recorded and will be linked on our website. I wanted to thank my team members, and particularly my team members, Nick Martinez and Kayla Tawa, for supporting us on the back end of this conversation. So here, as I said, I'm here with my friend, Cara Page, who's one of our Mental Health Advisory Board members. And I'm gonna highlight some aspects of her bio, but we're gonna put her full bio in the comments. So Cara is a Black, queer, feminist, cultural, and memory worker, curator, and organizer. Over the past 30 plus years, she has organized with LGBTQ, GNCI, people of color, and indigenous liberation movements in the US and the Global South, in the intersections of racial, gender, and economic justice, healing justice, and transformative justice. She's leading a new project, Changing Frequencies, which is an archival memory and cultural change project, which intervenes on generational trauma, and it seeks to unveil and hold accountable the medical industrial complex, the MIC, as an extension of state control and policing. We're also including some of the links to her work there, and if you haven't checked it out, either Changing Frequencies or Transforming the MIC, I highly encourage you to do so. Cara is one of the architects of the Healing Justice political strategy, which is why we asked her to join us today. And Healing Justice is deeply rooted in Black feminist traditions and shaped by Southern Black radical traditions. She's the co-founder of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, and she's the former executive director of the Audre Lorde Project. She's a recent recipient of the Soros Equality Fellowship and is an activist in residence at the Barnard Research Center for Women. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and of course to represent CLASP as well. As an advisory board member, I've learned so much from the experience being with the team. Yes.
So I'm going to start out with a question in the current context that we're in, COVID-19 pandemic. So as COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting people of color and exposing class lines, along with the continued exposure of racial injustice and uprisings, what is your current definition of the term healing?
Right, a very complicated, complex question. Thanks for starting us off on fire and strong, Isha. I really want to take a step back actually and ask the question of what is my definition of the medical industrial complex. It feels very important to name what we're trying to heal in this moment of COVID-19, in this moment of abolition against anti-Black racism, and for the uprisings against white supremacy, and really we are on the precipice of imagining something new around abolition, the defunding of police, the defunding of institutions, including the medical industrial complex that has been so pervasive in pathologizing, or let's say just policing communities of color, Black and brown bodies, trans, queer, gender non-binary bodies, people with disabilities, immigrant communities, women, so on and so forth. So just wrestling with this concept of this system, this institution of care that's so deeply embedded in colonizer, archaic beliefs of colonization, slavery, exploitation, and white supremacy. And this is the moment to say that out loud, right? There's no need to be behind the curtain anymore, behind the veil. Not that many of us were, but a lot of us are finally able to put our truth all out there because people are they're touching it, seeing it, paying attention, noticing it. And I think it's because of this moment of COVID-19. We had all this time to sit in our homes and ask the question, is state really going to take care of us? Mm-hmm. When we ask the question defining healing, I'm asking the question defining safety, defining collective care, defining interdependence, mutual aid. What do all these things mean when we were shut down on lockdown in our homes, be they safe or unsafe, with chosen family or birth family or state, wherever we were, as we had to ask the question, how will we survive in this moment? And do we have the agency to survive? So when I think about healing in a broad sense inside of this particular moment of fascism, of white supremacy, and of resistance, we can really wrestle with what does it mean to care for each other? What does it mean to build safety that is interdependent of each other, that my safety depends on your safety, depends on people who are incarcerated, their safety, depends on elders in nursing homes, their safety. These are big questions to wrestle with, but we can't define healing unless we wrestle with a pervasive violent history of scientific racism in medicine and healthcare that has never centered healing in the most genuine, authentic community-based way ever. Right? So then it's no holds bar wherever we can go with our imagination because we've been so confined.
Oh, that's so beautiful. So basically we got to rip everything up, start
Yes, yes.
over. So, okay, so just continuing with one of the conversations we had, my colleagues, Dr. Nia Westbay and Kayla Tawa, they hosted a conversation in July, which was entitled Protest, Movement Building, and Mental Health. And in that conversation, they spoke with three young organizers, Jasmine Wildcat, Hernan Carvante Martinez, and Lashana Mato, who are across the country who have been organizing for a long time. And they spoke about the power of organizing and the power of community healing in the space of community trauma and the power of organizing as a coping mechanism. But they also spoke about the extreme burnout that they face when trying to serve so many aspects of community. And you were alluding to that in your opening statement. So when we're thinking about healing justice, what is it and what does it look like?
That conversation was very powerful to hear about. And I really want to give a shout out to your colleague and comrade, Keisha, who's on the CLASP team, who wrote an incredible piece that everyone really needs to read. But we are pressed on every side. But we are pressed on every side, but we are not crushed. By Keisha Bird, Director of Youth Policy at CLASP. And I just want to, yes, just herald her for the memory that she named of what is it when we have survived cumulative acts of state, communal, interpersonal violence in our lives. How does that sit on our collective bodies as Black folks, as Latinx folks, as Indigenous, as immigrants, as disabled, as queer and trans, as single mothers, as, you know, so on and so forth. And the way that she so powerfully named that, and in this same conversation named the role of liberation inside of a healing-centered agenda that asks the question, how will we look at the complexities of generational trauma in our lives? That's healing justice. I mean, healing justice is rooted in a model of collective care, wellness, and safety. It is informed by a lineage of practitioners, healers, organizers that ask many of the same questions. I quote Fannie Lou Hamer, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? It is of the same lineage of Harriet Tubman that was a freedom fighter and a birth worker and a healer. How do we keep our people well while we are surviving, escaping, setting forth a new path of freedom and liberation? And healing justice was a direct response in the early 2000s to increased fascism, anti-Black racism, that was in excessively violent in the Southeast at that time. I was organizing in the US South. That is my political home and the home of my peoples. And I was witnessing, as learning as an organizer and cultural worker and memory worker, the ways that burnout was deeply affecting our organizing in movements, that individuals were being asked to leave movement, or they were choosing to leave because they felt they could not heal or hold unrest inside of movement. And I had to ask the question, well, wait a minute, wait. If we're leaving to heal, then how is healing not inseparable to liberation? And how can we talk about collective wellness and safety as inseparable to economic justice, environmental justice, disability justice? These are all the same things. What is our relationship to land, work, body, and spirit was a question being led by song, Southerners on New Ground, right? Organizing LGBTQ, predominantly working class Black and POC organizers on the ground in the South asking, what and how will we heal from violence and our relation, complex relationship to land, work, body, and spirit inside of white supremacy, inside of fascism, not just in the US South, but we were looking at movements in the global South in the early 2000s, studying and saying, what is the invitation to do this differently? And if we're going to talk about liberation and abolition, we've got to talk about healing. So healing justice, really in its like simplest form, became a term that several organizers, healers, health practitioners, nurses, therapists, predominantly Black, feminist, folks of color, indigenous, and white anti-racist organizers came together in the South asking the question, how will we build collective well-being emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychically, and environmentally for our communities? What will we do differently that roots in a Southern Black radical tradition of liberation that allows for the collective healing and safety of our communities? So it's got to be anti-capitalist, it's got to be abolitionist, and it's got to transform institutions like the medical industrial complex that are an extension of slavery and have never been for, by, or about our well-being. And it's got to ask the question, what is generational trauma? How has that deeply affected our lives? And how do we hold individual and collective trauma in movements so that it isn't siloed or divided or a separate piece, but is inherently integrated into our political organizing strategies? That is what healing justice is at its core. But we were very clear, that being we, a collective of healers, health practitioners that came together at that time called the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, we were very clear as a multi-racial, intergenerational, cross-gender, class, movement building collective to say, we are in the middle of a story that many of our ancestors have been answering or asking these questions, have been forced to decentralize ways to take care of each other and ourselves because we started to rely on state or depend on state because of the history in this country of saying public health is better. The state will provide, and always jostling with, wait, something isn't right here. My body says I can't trust this system that has actually massively sterilized Puerto Rican women, indigenous women, women of African descent, has excluded Black gay men and Black trans women, during HIV/AIDS, queer and trans community, or completely decimated this idea of survival economies or sex workers as being valuable to the livelihood of all of us and not being othered, and then people with disabilities being the end of all, the utmost, seen as invaluable because they could not, because they were seen as dependents of state. So here we are in 2020, actually still asking the question, how do we value people with mental, physical, emotional, developmental disabilities? Be they Black, people of color, indigenous, migrant, working class, poor, in rural or urban settings, that they are still not valued in these systems and are pushed out onto the street and then policed, or incarcerated. So healing justice was a response to these things, but it was a particular moment in the Southeast that we were coming together to ask these questions and then to build strategy. And it looked like, for us, mapping conditions in the South that allow the state to divide us from being able to hold collective care and safety together as central to our political well-being and survival. It meant, how do we grieve loss of freedom fighters, of community members, to prisons, to state violence, to police murders, to sterilization? How do we grieve these moments of horrific torture on Black and brown bodies, in particular in the South, as an extension of state control? Healing justice asks the question, how will we build collective safety and care across traditions and disciplines, not just earth, energy, body-based traditions, but birth workers, transformative therapists, transformative nurses and doctors who were already not complicit with state. Look at some abortion, people doing abortions that were very much rooted in a grassroots safety collective care strategy. Not the ones trying to build profit off of it, but the ones that were trying to build safety and well-being for communities of color in the South. Not just we're talking post Roe v. Wade too, right? Let's be clear. Roe v. Wade only impacted some, not everyone. We have work to do. So, and Healing Justice said, how will we root in place and understand that our traditions have been quintessential to our survival in the South in particular? And if we're not looking at ways to hold the memory of those traditions and document them and pass them on to the next lineage, then we are allowing the state to completely decentralize any idea of infrastructure that allowed us to be able to take care of ourselves and each other. That's healing justice.
There's a lot there, Cara.
It's a lot, right? But I was like, but people said, wait, this is too big. And I was like, is it? Map conditions, honor the survival of our people, how we've done it, and tell the stories of what we can do and use. Ask the question, collective safety and care. What do we want to build? What does that even look like outside of state? Or if you're working inside of state institutions, what do you need to dismantle and untether from racist, classist, ableist notions of what healthy is? Because healthy is defined by these old ideas of who is healthy. It is white, it is male, it is cisgendered, it is able-bodied, it is wealthy, right? Because it was based on who could afford access to care, who had the right to afford access to care, very much defined systems of healthy, including the public healthcare system that many of us, myself included and my family, rely on, but it was not genuinely built for the well-being of this body, of your body. And I want to be clear, healing justice was a framework. It wasn't a movement, because there are movements that hold some of these questions, like the disability justice movement, the environmental justice movement, the reproductive justice movement. We just wanted to bring in this piece around how do you politicize the role of healers and health practitioners inside of these movements so that they are also a part of generating strategy and changing and dismantling these systems of care.
Cara, I have a lot of questions now, but
okay,
I'll stick to my question before. But one thing, you had shared this beautiful drawing with me. Do you want me to share?
Yes, let's share that. Yes, thank you. I get so excited when I talk about this work.
Oh, no, but yeah, no.
Okay, so we have this visual here, excuse me, out of frame, that is by Claudia Lopez, or I was presenting with Erica Woodland, director of the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. And I was introducing healing justice inside of the frame of social justice movements, or sort of looking at systemic oppression. How does healing justice respond to healing from trauma from systems of oppression? And this visual here, if we could pop it up, was visually drafted as I was explaining healing justice. So just to sort of reiterate, you've got generational trauma in the middle. Thanks, Isha, for popping this up.
Sure.
And just this understanding of what does it mean to survive on a cellular level. And I give deep respect to an emergent field on generational trauma that was really led by, or continues to be led by, Indigenous, Black, and women of color, writers, scholars, organizers, practitioners, including Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, the writer of Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington, Dr. Joy DeGruyer, looking at post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Mindy Fulalove, so on and so forth. And you've got community organizers who are frontline experiencing trauma, holding trauma for and within movements, social justice movements. And what we found as the Kindred Collective is, how are we talking about trauma when we're organizing? Because as we're experiencing immense loss and grief, how do we scramble and catch up to literally the breath that needs to be taken as we experience in this circle at the top, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, adult supremacy as young organizers, ableism, Christian supremacy, colonization and slavery. That if you're in a particular experience of constantly battling these things, how and where is there a place for grief, for release of shame, for rest, and for exploring the safety, security, and protection from these things that are constantly we're being pummeled by. So Healing Justice just asked the question, can we wrestle with trauma? And we started to meet with organizers throughout the Southeast asking the question, what does individual and collective trauma look like in our communities? And what does generational trauma look like in our organizing? And again, a simple definition of generational trauma is, on a cellular level, you may not have experienced the original wound of colonization. You may not have been standing there when slavery was occurring, but you, on a cellular level, carry the memory of the violence of the institution of slavery that comes through our bodies on a memory cellular level, and that we're still carrying that shame, that fear, that grief. And a very quick way to talk about it. And so we just asked the question with organizers, what do you feel? What does it feel like to experience burnout and trauma in organizing? And how do we transform that and unpack it? And we talked a lot about institutions of care that are deeply rooted in the ideas of eugenics, really the genetic removal of Black and Brown, Indigenous people with disabilities, that healthcare models don't look at trauma, that oftentimes they're looking at product and profit, and they're not looking at long-term pervasive ideas that have really broken down our ability to even understand the body in a collective, authentic, beautiful, and loving way that's in a relationship to land, to place, to sovereignty. So this diagram here in the center shows you eugenics. How do we wrestle with the grief from people being genetically removed, either through massive sterilization? We're looking at the massive sterilization at the detention centers of the ICE detention center in Georgia. This is a lineage of massive sterilizations because the belief is that white supremacists believe you need to remove the next generation of communities of color, or they'll become too dependent, too resistant. And so let's literally remove them through massive sterilizations, which has occurred to the Puerto Rican community, which has occurred to the Indigenous community during colonization, to enslaved African people. This goes on. Everyone thinks it's the past. This eugenic idea continues in our healthcare systems. It's seen as safety and preserving. Population control is hugely influential on policy in the global South and in this country, and it relies on that women of color's fertility is the root cause of environmental degradation. So we are now looking at climate justice being this heightened concern, but you only see still the protection of white bodies. There's only white people going to Mars as the planet is dying, right? I wish I had my song Tribe Called Quest about, about who's going into space, because that's real. Population control still pervades these ideas that women of color's fertility is the root cause of environmental degradation that preempts wars and policies that control and police women's bodies and continue to make us expendable. It preempts people with disabilities. Eugenics preempts people with disabilities, incarcerated people, queer and trans, anyone that's seen as other, as being another force to genetically remove. So we're wrestling with these old ideas that are insistent inside of a healthcare system. And just to call out Aurora Lemons Morales, who's a disability justice organizer, what our bodies require to thrive is what the world requires. And she is a writer and a Puerto Rican feminist organizer, queer, queer artist who persistently has built with the healing justice political framework. How are we looking at what gives us power to survive and thrive? How are we going beyond these disease-based ideas that are prescribed, or this idea that we will be criminals, that we will have disease because that we will be sinful because we're Black, we're brown, we're queer, we're trans, we're disabled, we're migrant, so on and so forth. So healing justice says enough with all that. We want to build a community-led response to our safety and well-being. We want to build emergent process that considers holding grief and crisis and violence, even after natural disasters. How do we hold our people and don't rely on the state? Because as we witnessed during Hurricane Katrina, not the storm, but the way the state literally lynched people, left people to die on the roof of their homes in the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans. The cultural strategy, the political strategy, and the spiritual strategy is also important to healing justice, which allows us to explore our relationship to land, body, work, spirit, and economy as critical to our collective survival. So that was a long answer to it, but this is a great visual to sort of understand what it is we were fighting against or with our political strategy and what we're trying to build. It's not just anti, but it's also what we are for. And it will take radical imagination, which I know Keisha was speaking to in her article and the panel.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Cara. I think it's helpful to have both your setting the context and the framework, and also seeing this as well for some of us who are visual learners too.
Yes, exactly. I'm working on the visual, the graphic novel of healing justice and the medical industrial complex.
So I think you answered some of my other questions about the origins of how the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective were thinking of healing justice, but I wanted you to talk more about the ideas of transformative and healing justice frameworks and how they work together, and in what kind of environment is the healing justice framework particularly important?
Fantastic. Healing justice and transformative justice are inseparable. And I have many comrades who I've organized with for decades now. We don't make a distinction between what we believe to be an invitation or a necessity through transformative justice, that we can end violence, but we cannot end it with using violence to end violence, right? That transformative justice is an overarching framework really that's looking at the core concept of we can't end violence with violence, and to promote transformative ways to end violence without using harm and punishment, then we have to look at abolition. What is an abolitionist politic that demands the end of prisons, the end of punitive the end of punishment, the end of policing and surveillance, which are all inherently violent. And quoting from Mariam Kaba, a comrade and mentor and friend, who says, TJ insists that we have to address the roots of violence and uproot oppression to create a just society, and to ask the question, how do we intervene? How do we prevent and transform harm and violence without using more punishment? And Mariam Kaba speaks to this in a lot of her work, Survived and Punished. There is a movement of transformative justice where people are looking at ways to hold these interventions to prevent and transform harm without punishment. And it's an exciting, scary place because we don't know what that can look like. If you look at familial, interpersonal violence, communal and state violence, to even consider that we could end violence, that we could intervene or prevent harm, these are huge concepts, right? The idea of defunding the police, people panic and say, what will we do without police? I was like, what could we do with building safety with each other and ourselves? The question isn't what will we do without police? What will we do with each other, right? To sustain safety and well-being. Healing justice asks these similar questions and says, and how will we heal from the generational trauma of the violence and harm that's been committed on us over centuries? And how will we imagine collective well-being inside of safety? How are those constantly in relationship to each other? And both healing justice and transformative justice are seeking an interdependence. We're trying to understand what is our interdependence to earth, to land, to all communities living. How are we really showing care and dignity for one another? And transcending geographical borders, how are we not committing ourselves to wars and tortures of other cultures and communities because we don't understand or we don't know, because it's so rooted in violence and oppression and harm and abuse? We want to break that cycle. And transformative justice and healing justice both say we want to look at this through an abolitionist frame, that we want to center our interdependence, our dignity, our love and care for each other. And we want to understand how we can build something transformative that really relies on holding each other accountable when we go through struggle, when there is pain, when there is harm. What are we willing to do to hold processes that interrupt cycles of abuse? I am a survivor of family violence. I went through years of hiding being a survivor of family violence because I was protecting the person, my father, who was doing the emotional abuse and physical harm of my mother and other women. And even in his transformation, I found myself left back in the pastures of like, where's my transformation as a survivor and a witness of violence for years? And then for myself, coming out as a Black queer organizer, experiencing violence, experiencing harm and misogyny, and not understanding how do I protect myself if within my own family unit, I couldn't protect myself as a child, or protect the people I loved because they were experiencing immense harm and abuse from someone else I loved. These are complicated stories. So that means that trauma is complex when you know the person who's caused the harm. And I'm saying I never put my father in prison for the harm that he caused. And I made a very conscious choice to not call the police multiple times and to create systems of care and safety for myself and some of the women that he was harming until he went into his own recovery. And then I became one of his caretakers with my siblings and my stepmom on how then do I take care of the person who had caused harm but was actually healing and a survivor of his own childhood violence. Whew, these are complex stories, right? So TJ and HJ hold these spaces that allow you to untether or pull and say, this is not an easy A to Z equation. This will require courage, bravery, wrestling with pain and grief, and complicated stories in our lives, in our lineages, that need to be unpacked and unraveled for us to heal.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think when you were just sharing about those intersections, I was really thinking about how important it is to be vulnerable,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
and you have so much empathy, and how that is so needed in order to build community and to lift each other up, and that we need to really build trust with one another and
Thank you.
letting go. So
Right.
thank you.
Build trust and practices of trust. Like Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline, right? I think healing is a discipline. Organizing requires discipline and rigor. But what will it require of ourselves? Like you said, vulnerability, trust, discipline, and rigor to heal from trauma in our lives with each other, to not leave, but say, okay, how are we going to walk this, move through this? And I'm not saying to sabotage situations, to take over an organization because of your individual trauma. I'm not saying that. No institution can fix the trauma that has been ongoing. But I'm asking the question, how will our institutions not continue harm, not continue to perpetuate trauma without being accountable, right? And then I'm asking in movements, how do we learn and heal together and actually consider the practice of healing, the practice of trust as integral to political organizing as it is to build a campaign and a political strategy.
Yeah, we're in this together. Yeah.
That's right. And how does care and safety? I mean, we're looking at the targeting of organizers for safety. We're looking at increased burnout and trauma. Again, another cycle through the rise of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and homophobia, transphobia, all the things. And I was like, oh, are we in the same place? But we're not, because I do see more people in organizations, institutions, communities, and movements ask the question, what will we do to take care of each other, to build collective care and safety? Even in COVID-19, these mutual aid networks that exploded, or the pod mapping that's been deeply led by the Transformative Justice Collaborative Collective in the Bay Area, it's rooted in that frame, right? That asks the question, what will I do to take care of you and myself? What will we do to be safe together? And that shows me there's a possibility, right? But if we look at the history of medicine, science, and healthcare in this country, it decentralized community-led infrastructure. During slavery, there was absolute community-led healing inside of slavery, enslaved Black people that were able to figure it out, build, and birth generations of Black folks, despite the heinous crimes, mental, psychic, spiritual crimes being held upon them. Then after slavery, you move into a public health system, sorry, pre-public health care, but the Freedmen Bureau's hospitals that the state created for like 5 years, temporary hospitals in the South for formerly enslaved Black people to have a place for healthcare. What a setup, because it made them dependent, my family's dependent on a healthcare system when before our communities were taking care of ourselves and each other. But instead it said, oh no, go to the doctor, they're the expert, they know best. Go to a white doctor, a white institution. But then the Freedmen's Bureau's hospitals were pulled out. And so then what did you do? You had nothing. You decimated the community-led strategy, not decimated, but you rattled it, you decentralized it. Then you focus on an institution making us dependent on it, and then you pull that out from under us. There was nothing left but a public healthcare system that said, we can give you more. These are some questions. I'm working on a timeline with Anjali Taneja and Susan Raffo, healers and doctors, looking at the history of the medical industrial complex and the ways we lost our rhythm and our momentum to build, because either it was criminalized, like harm reduction, stolen or co-opted, right? And then sold back to us. But we're also looking at mapping the resistance to the medical industrial complex. And we really hope that shakes up for people ways to imagine strategies of, oh, I see now the system of how big pharma loops into, post-slavery healthcare systems and how these things have talked to each other. How do we unloosen their hold so that we can learn how to reimagine and centralize care work that is community-led, that is survivor-led, that is led with agency, autonomy, and interdependence, and trust, like you're saying. I believe this is possible, but we've got to understand how we have participated in creating these systems of care, all of us in some ways, without knowing without asking the question, what is possible?
Yeah.
We've got to keep pushing ourselves.
Yeah. Of course, so many of us have
That's
gone
right.
status quo and
You know the deal. That's right. But
not
so many of us are asking, and I think it's a moment. I think in this abolitionist transformative justice moment of defunding the police, people are saying, what else should we defund? What else should we reimagine and create, that feels possible to me. Even though the
Mm-hmm.
planet is dying, I feel like this is actually the moment to say,
Exactly.
we've got to do this differently.
Exactly. Okay, I didn't expect time to go so fast. So I have
Yes.
a question here
Okay.
from those who are watching, and just a reminder again for those who are watching us on a live stream to please put in your questions and any comments that you have. So we have someone who's asking, who's curious about your thoughts on accountability mechanisms and
Right.
what does that mean for policy and systems right now?
That's fascinating. I mean, I always rely on Isha and my policy questions because I'm not a policy wonkhead. Is that the right term? Um,
Yeah.
I mean, we are in a government that is so not accountable right now. I mean, maybe forever, but extra heightened, hyper lack of accountability right now. So it's an interesting question because I would say, and Isha, can we riff a little bit on this? Is that
Sure.
it requires vulnerability and trust and a breaking through of a narrative that says, I'm I'm for you or I'm against you versus I'm with you. Like if policy is set up that this is only to improve the other and it's not looking at how will this change all of us, I do think that's a setup for failure. This is a very esoteric way of thinking about policy, but so I need to understand policy that is really centering, just like this new policy that y'all are exploring, healing centered liberation. That is, even by the word healing, you're saying, how will we be accountable to each other's healing and well being? What
Yeah.
if we write policies that lead with that narrative? Isn't that changing the game?
Yeah. I think that's a big part of this, the Healing Centered Liberation Policy
Okay.
work that we're doing, and to the commentary, Keisha's commentary, our fearless leader, who
Yes.
you were that you were alluding to,
Yes. Thank you.
that piece has Keisha included thinking about accountability and how systems can be accountable for the harms that have been created, and what, having these conversations is part of that the beginning of the conversation, and trying to get various levels of systems, whether it's local, state, federal, whatever we're looking at, to be held accountable. But I agree with you that it isn't like a for or against. How do we work with each other?
With
But
each other.
yeah, it's all about the way that we perceive each other too. Because if
That's
we
right.
think there's a hierarchy, it's not gonna work.
But I do think we have to start asking questions around safety. What does safety look like? So if we're doing policy around healthcare, I'm interested in what does safety look like inside of policies around healthcare? And because I think that then changes, it kind of throws it on its side and says, health, what is the ultimate outcome? That that we will all receive dignified, accessible care that we feel safe to even receive, because I can name all the communities, sex workers, Black, queer and trans, folks of color, indigenous folks. We don't want to walk in the door of public health clinics. We don't want to access healthcare that has been dangerous and risky, right? Because it is the same mechanism of state as the ICE detention center and prisons that are still massively sterilizing women of color and Black women, and isolating and putting people of Arab descent in solitary confinement for weeks because of Islamophobia. So like these things are not, they are enmeshed, they are not untangled. So can we stop pretending that they are? Actually put white supremacy in the middle of the conversation, put safety in the middle of the conversation, even when we're wrestling with policy. And to your point, ask the question, who, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Who's here? Who's designing these policies? How are they community centered? I missed an opportunity earlier to say that Healing Justice also asked, how do we build more integrative, holistic care models?
Mhm.
So it is my charge that healing justice was never just about healers, but it was also about health practitioners and therapists, doing and social workers who see the problem and want to dismantle it and reimagine it. Policymakers, is that the same question? Who's coming to the table to reimagine and not just talking to the same people over and over? We've got to expand the dialogue and really listen to new ways people would approach healthcare in this country from the communities that are most affected by it. It's so obvious, but it still gets lost.
Absolutely. And defining, redefining who is an expert.
That's right. There is no I don't I even saying expert, let's just bump it out. How
Yeah.
do we all practice? It is
Mhm.
practice. I'm not saying we're all practitioners, not everyone wants to be, but we all deserve the autonomy and agency to say, this is how I want to practice
Absolutely.
my emotional, physical, spiritual, environmental well-being. We
Mhm.
all deserve that.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So we kind of went kind of off the accountability, but I'm here for it. I also think don't just do racial equity 101. That is not an accountability process. Go deep into the annals of your organizations and find out where you have perpetuated harm and abuse on the communities you're trying to work with, and stop trying to save people. Really try to just show up and see what can you do in the service of people, not to save them.
Thank you. I have a couple of other questions here.
Oops. Okay.
So, someone writes, I'm watching from unceded Kumeyaay Nation territory, also known as San Diego.
Thank you.
This work and these practices, it can be so lonely and so amazingly liberating too. Do
Mhm.
you, Cara, have advice or encouragement for those of us who are working on transforming ourselves and our communities, but face exile for voicing the need for transformation?
Oh, deep question.
Mhm.
It can be lonely. I spent a long time interviewing elders and asked really for permission when I was in the Southeast, stirring the pot around healing justice. I really asked permission and asked elders of African, Asian, Indigenous, Latinx descent. I said, well, how have you healed? What did you do to heal in movement and within communities of color and Indigenous and Black folks? And at first I got, healing, we don't got time for that. Yeah, keep it moving. Like we're trying to get to liberation. We love you, but where did you come from? You know, just like real, real good questions of, I'm not so sure that you really get what we're trying to do here.
Mhm.
And then hurricanes Katrina and Rita came. And after those storms, people said, I remember this feeling of grief and trauma, like I felt it during the Black Power movement, during AIM, during the Asian and Latinx student movements, during the civil rights movement. I remember what this feels like in my body. I'm leaving my body. This is so painful to watch what's happening to the Gulf Coast. And folks really said, and that loneliness, it dissipated for a moment because people they saw themselves in the questions that I was asking. Um, I don't know what it is for them, this person who asked the question, to experience the loneliness, but I do want to say, I do believe this work is an invitation, and that people can only come to it when they're ready to come to it. And so perhaps could you wait a while? Could you see? Because I think people come at different times with different things. That's what I've experienced, and it was definitely lonely. But then people said, "Oh, I remember." I always say this is memory work, and if you have immense grief and trauma from remembering, um, it will, which what in some ways we already know, but we've forgotten it. It's been part of the colonialist project to forget tradition, practice, our connection, our interconnectedness. So it's going to take a moment to sit with that, remember that, to be in the practice of that. So I hope that that loneliness is dissipated by others who come when they're ready to. But I do believe you might just need to wait it out a little bit. because I do believe people will come when they're ready.
We are running short on time, but there's
Yes.
another really great question, and I threw away the rest of my questions. But
Okay.
I'm going to ask this question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask you one last question
Okay.
to close it out. So this question is, how do others adopt the healing justice framing and walk the talk as we manage our trauma? Why do you believe some communities are against the defund police narrative, and how can we help communities understand the history and why it's important to reimagine?
Ooh, that's a big question. All right, let me just go into Organizer Brain 101. Map the conditions and context you're doing the work. If people don't collectively have a mapping of what's happening in their communities, where they're lacking safety and care, I think it's going to be hard to map any kind of possibility or imagination. Let's look at what historically has happened in your neighborhood, on the block, start there, or in the communities you're working with. I think you need that collective narrative to understand, oh, this is how policing or how frontline responders or whatever it is have been barriers and not always um, allowed for us to feel safe and to feel cared for. So let's wrestle with that, mapping the conditions. Then what is the safety that you're looking for? Map safety. What kind of safety and care do you want to define? I've been in conversation with folks in the global South, amazing organizing healers in Brazil, facing the height of fascism, who have mapped their context and condition, understand the crisis they are living in, and still believe what is possible because they come with a collective knowledge. They're like, this is what has been, and this is what we know we can do to survive because they have defined safety and care for themselves. So even that's step two. Then step three, then get into your strategy. But don't preempt the strategy before you really look at context and condition and what does it mean to be safe and to be well. You have to define it. It's been defined for us too much for us to be able to understand that esoterically. We have to put it down on a page and map it out and then move through the strategies that can make it happen.
I'm actually going to ask you two more questions.
Okay, 3 minutes. I feel like I am on a timer. Come on, let's go.
All right. So, as we in this healing centered liberation policy work,
Yes.
as we work to reimagine the justice, workforce, education, and healthcare system,
Yeah.
how do we make sure we prioritize healing?
Mm. Well, I had the privilege of being on a call yesterday with you, Isha, and Dr. Kima Taylor, who is an amazing doctor and healer, I would say, and public speaker. And she said, if we're not talking about education, that we talked about silos. We talked about silos of movement and we talked about silos in institutions. And it is a very white supremacist, I think, a white supremacist idea of being that all these things are separated. So Dr. Kima Taylor talks about how these things are integrated. You can't talk about the conditions of education in this country and not talk about wellness and care. We can't talk about transportation, not talk about how you will get to education, to your schools, virtually or not. But if you're not safe on your transportation, so like safety and care is in the center. White supremacy and of course other supremacies and oppression are in the center. If we consider a healing strategy in all of those fields, where would we be if we considered talking about collective care and safety and not the same questions per se, but a lens that looked at education, transportation, healthcare in this country? I'm assuming you're saying in the US or more broadly, war, genocide, that we looked at it through healing, care, and safety. How would that shift our narrative on what we are asking for, what we are fighting for, and what we're trying to build?
Thank you. And then my last question for you is, Cara, what is your call to action?
As the ambulance drives by, I just want to say that I'm incredibly moved and changed by this moment of COVID-19. I don't think we can ever go back to whatever was normal. I wasn't pleased with the state of things, but now I am humbled by the state of things because now we're on the precipice and we're not going back of I think, a cosmological shift in this world because the planet asked us to slow down through a virus and then started to regenerate itself. Like there's something that happened in the last 6 months that changed all of us. And so I believe that we need to build power. We need to build our relationship to ourselves and the planet and really take pause on what our relationship is to land, work, body, and spirit. And when I say work, I mean economy, different economies that will permit the survival of everyone on this planet, not just a certain few that deserve to survive climate injustice, but to bring us all along to be able to survive what is happening to the planet. And this moment of deep grief and death has to ask of us to understand what does it mean to hold grief, death, and trauma in all of our work, and that we can't pretend that everything that has happened in the last 6 months or continues to happen just stops. But actually, how does it change then the pace of how we do our work? How does it change who we are in the work and who we are willing to become because of this moment? Um, I deeply believe that my demands or my hopes are to build infrastructure for collective care and safety, absolutely, to defund mental health and MIC institutions that cause harm as an extension of prisons and policing. But what I really want is to sustain and remember traditions of care and safety and do our work and how we're going to build interdependence with each other and the earth. Yeah.
Cara, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And I think we have a lot to think about and a lot to work on together as we are co-conspirators in the work.
Yes.
For all of you who were able to join us today, thank you so much for joining us. And as I said, the conversation is continuing on healing-centered liberation policy. We have a number of webinars and conversations coming up throughout the year. Please check out our website, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
It's an honor. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and Isha and CLASP for your vision and your grace. Thank you. Deeply humbled to be here.